I'm going to show you a new feature in Omniscope reports we're calling named groupings and named measures. Before I start, let's just have a quick look at the data that I'm working with in this particular report. This is European ski resort data. So each record represents a ski resort, and then we can see the country and some metadata about that resort. I created a very simple summary dashboard here where we can see the number of slopes by country, the ski pass price by country, and the height of the resorts by country. So before I talk about named groupings and named measures, what is a grouping and what is a measure? Well, very briefly, a grouping is a way to break data down into pots or groups. So if I had a bar view, then one grouping option that we have here is the split. And so I can say how we split the bars. And in this case, I can split by country. Another grouping we have is stack. So for example, I could stack by snow parks. And the measure is a way to calculate the value of the bars. So in this case, the measure is record count, but I could choose a different measure, which might be total slope. And you can see the data changes accordingly. So what are named groupings and named measures? So they can be configured in the data model, and they're a central repository of groupings and measures. If I click on the groupings tab here and then add a named grouping, I can configure that grouping like I would do in a view. So I'm going to choose that grouping field to be country. Likewise, for measures, I can add a name measure here, and I'll just leave that as highest point mean. So now what I can do is I can go into a view, so I'll add a bar view, and where I choose a grouping, I can choose a named grouping, the grouping that I just created there. And likewise, where I select a measure, I can choose a named measure. Now, the advantage of these being centrally stored is that I can configure them in more than one view. So I can add a pie view, and I can choose to use the same grouping there. And I can change those groupings in one place, or the measures, and they will be reflected in all views that reference those. Now, this is particularly useful when I'm when I've got a view with a formula that I want to reuse. So let's add a bar view, and I'm going to split by country. I'm going to choose a measure, and I'm going to enter a formula measure here. Now, I've pre-prepared a measure here, and this measure I'm calling snowboard score. And what it's doing is it's giving me a score of each of the resort based on how good it is for snowboarders. And you can see here now, each country has got a snowboard score. Now, if I want to reuse that formula elsewhere, I'd have to, before we've added this name measures and name groupings functionality, I'd have to copy and paste it. But now what I can do is I can create a named measure with this formula measure, and then I can just reuse it by selecting that measure. So what I could do is I could go into my name measure section and add a name measure and then copy the formula across. But there's a shortcut to do this if you've already created these measures that you want to convert into name measures. So if you just select the measure and then select save as name measure, and I'm going to call this snowboard score. And now if we go into the data model, you can see in the name measures tab that this snowboard score is a name measure that's been created to be used. So I can now use that wherever I need to. I'll add a pie view, split by country, and I'm going to choose snowboard score. And exactly the same advantages of the measures that we had before. If I want to change or tweak that measure slightly, I can do in just one location. Another really useful feature of name measures and name groupings is the ability to create choices. If I go into my name groupings, and instead of clicking add name grouping, I'm going to choose add grouping choice. You can see it's created a name grouping with two choices here. And I can add as many choices as I want. I can configure those like I would do any other grouping. And likewise, I can do the same with measures. So I'm going to add a measure choice. I'm going to select some more measures. So how do I use these choices? But first I'm going to do is I'm going to open a filters view and select these grouping and measure choices. And now I'm going to add a bar view. I'm going to choose the split, and I'm going to choose that grouping choice. And for the measure, I'm going to choose the measure choice. So what you can see here is that I can change the grouping dynamically, and I can change the measure dynamically. So you can expose these choices to an end user and allow an end user to decide what data they want to see. As well as this, I can create multi-select choices. If I go into here and I'm going to add a new measure choice and a grouping choice. For my grouping choice, I'm going to choose country and night ski and snow parks. For my measure choice, I'm going to choose 3 measures here: beginner slopes, intermediate slopes, and difficult slopes. I'm just going to give these a name so that I know which named measure and which named groupings I've created. So I'm just going to call it multi-select measure. And for my grouping, multi-select grouping. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the choice type in here from single select, which we had before, to multi-select. And I'm going to do the same for the measure. If I add a filters view, and I'm going to choose the multi-select grouping and the multi-select measure, you can see these are now checkboxes to choose these. I'll kind of configure a couple of views to use these. So these are useful in any places where you might want to choose more than one grouping or more than one measure. So like splits in a bar or in a pivot view. For this example, use a Sankey for the grouping. I'm going to choose a group network, and I'm going to choose my multi-select grouping. And now what we can do is we can decide how to break the data down. So we can just break the data down by country, or we can break the data down further by night ski and snow parks, or we can just choose to break the data down by night ski and snow parks. For my multi-select measures, I'm going to add a bar view, and I'm going to split by country. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to stack by measures. And for my measures, I'm going to choose the multi-select measure that I just created. And now what I can do is I can allow users to configure how they stack the data. We're looking at all the slopes, and they can choose to just see beginner slopes or a combination of beginner, intermediate, and difficult slopes. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Thanks.